So we've been putting off a discussion about Banquo, and that's not because I hate him or that I don't think he's a very interesting character, but because there's enough to talk about for him to warrant his own video. Also, up to this point in this series, we've advanced somewhat steadily through the first two acts of Macbeth, skipping backwards and forwards a little bit here and there. And now that we've arrived at Act 3, the time to talk about Banquo has come, because it's sort of his act. Remember that Banquo was with Macbeth when they first encountered the witches in Act 1. Macbeth was immediately taken with what the witches had to tell him about his future, and what we noticed about Banquo then was that he was keeping a somewhat level head about himself. But he wasn't a complete skeptic either. He asks for his future to be told too, but he tacks on at the very end that he doesn't really care what they have to say either way. He says, "My noble partner you greet with present grace and great prediction of noble having and of royal hope, that he seems rapt withal. To me you speak not. If you can look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not, speak then to me, who neither beg nor fear your favors nor your hate." He hears three things from them: that he's, 1, greater than Macbeth but lesser, that he's not so happy yet much happier, and that he will get kings. In other words, his descendants will be kings, although he himself will never be one. And of course, because this is Shakespeare, and in Shakespeare prophecies always come true, but never in the way that people predict, all three of these predictions of the witches comes true. That first bit of news, that he's greater than Macbeth but lesser, can be taken in two ways. If taken in connection with that last prediction, then it means that his blood, or his seed, or whatever you want to call it, will overall reign on the Scottish throne longer than Macbeth will. But if we also consider the moral condition of the two men, Banquo is unquestionably greater. He is not tempted by ambition after hearing the witches' prophecies. He doesn't murder to get his way. In this sense, he's greater than Macbeth because he's the better man. The second part of the prediction, that he's not so happy yet much happier, can also be taken in two ways. Obviously, he's not so happy as Macbeth, because 1, he'll never be king himself, and 2, he's not long for this world. But he's much happier because, again, his future descendants will rule Scotland much longer than Macbeth ever will, and also because he has a clean conscience. We find out in this play what committing an evil act does to someone's soul. Later on, when Lady Macbeth starts having her episodes of not sleepwalking, the doctor that observes her says that such a thing is a great disturbance in nature, and that it's indicative of an overcharged heart. He says, "Foul whisperings are abroad. Unnatural deeds do breed unnatural troubles. Infected minds to their deaf pillows will discharge their secrets. More needs she the divine than the physician. God forgive us all." And the lady who was with the doctor, who has seen everything that took place, says, "I would not have such a heart in my bosom for the dignity of the whole body." In the same way, his evil act does damage to Macbeth's soul, or psyche, or whatever you want to call it. Near the end of the play, he says, "I have almost forgot the taste of fears. The time has been, my senses would have cooled to hear a night shriek, and my fell of hair would at a dismal treatise rouse and stir as life were in it. I have supped full with horrors. Direness, familiar to my slaughterous thoughts, cannot once start me." This is not a desirable state for anyone. We learn from Macbeth that someone can't commit such an atrocious act as murdering another human being without it forever changing them. For the second time in this series, I'll bring up the Harry Potter novels. In them, we're introduced to the idea that murdering someone splits the soul in half, and that the more you kill, the more it rips the soul apart. It's described as a mutilation that takes place, and as something that's against nature. This is what has happened to Macbeth, but in a less literal, or in another sense a more literal way than in those novels. So when the question arises of who is happier, Macbeth or Banquo, the answer is obviously Banquo. But it's the third part of the witches' prophecies that makes any solid, tangible promises, that Banquo's descendants will be kings. Now as he sits back and watches the witches' prophecies about Macbeth come true, he begins to believe that what they said about him will also come true. But still, he decides to let things play out on their own. He isn't going to take any definitive steps towards making things happen like Macbeth does. Macbeth, however, is thinking a whole lot about the prophecy about Banquo. At the beginning of Act 3, the two are still putting on a show of friendship, although at this point they're both suspicious of each other. Banquo has a hunch, which turns out to be a pretty good one, that Macbeth did something bad to become king. And Macbeth, of course, has good reasons to fear Banquo. Macbeth says this: "To be thus is nothing," to be king is what he's talking about, "but to be safely thus. Our fears in Banquo stick deep, and in his royalty of nature reigns that which would be feared. 'Tis much he dares, and, to that dauntless temper of his mind, he hath a wisdom that doth guide his valor to act in safety. There is none but he whose being I do fear, and under him my genius is rebuked, as it is said Mark Antony's was by Caesar. He chid the sisters, when first they put the name of king upon me, and bade them speak to him. Then, prophet-like, they hailed him father to a line of kings. Upon my head they placed a fruitless crown, and put a barren scepter in my grip. Thence to be wrenched with an unlineal hand, no son of mine succeeding. If it be so, for Banquo's issue have I filed my mind. For them the gracious Duncan have I murdered, put rancours in the vessel of my peace only for them, and mine eternal jewel given to the common enemy of man to make them kings, the seed of Banquo kings. Rather than so, come, fate, into the list, and champion me to the utterance." So there's really two separate problems Macbeth has with Banquo at this point. One is that he thinks Banquo's descendants will overthrow him, and that all of the horrible deeds he's committed will be for nothing. But there's also the fear that Banquo knows the truth about Duncan's murder and will tell on him. He says he fears Banquo's royalty of nature. He's honorable, and what's more important, Banquo is the only other person who knows that these prophecies have been made. In a sense, he's the only witness that could reveal Macbeth's motives for murder. This fear of being caught is eating away at Macbeth. Banquo hasn't said anything about giving him up. He should really have no reason to fear, but it's eating him up anyway. And as we learn all the time in literature, a guilty conscience leads people to do crazy things. Sometimes even to exaggerate the original fault, other times to actually reveal the fault themselves. If you're familiar with The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, then this should remind you a bit of that story's protagonist, or antagonist, or whatever. The guy kills the old man who lives with him, apparently because he didn't like the man's evil-looking eye, read the story, and then dismembers his body and hides it under the floorboards. Now, when the police come to investigate, they don't really suspect anything, and the narrator is about to get away with the murder. But he keeps hearing a steady beating sound coming from beneath the floorboards, the beating of the old man's heart. Now, of course, the heart isn't really beating, it's the narrator's paranoia, his fear of being discovered, and probably his subconscious guilt at having committed such a horrible deed. So he confesses. He says, "Tear up the floorboards, the heart's down there." And interestingly enough, there are some phrases in The Telltale Heart that are very similar to passages that we find in Macbeth. When the narrator is shining a lantern into the old man's room, the light falls right on the man's evil eye, and the narrator calls it that damned spot. This echoes Lady Macbeth's sleepwalking speech, as she roams about the castle making motions as if she's washing her hands and saying, "Out, damned spot," meaning the spot of Duncan's blood that she still imagined to be there, of course. So there's that, and also the narrator's observation that there was no blood to wash out, and no stain, because he dismembered the old man's body in the bathtub. Macbeth also was concerned with stains, mentioning after he murdered Duncan that even if he had an entire ocean to wash his blood-covered hands, they would turn the sea red instead of cleansing him at all. So all this is going through Macbeth's mind, and he finally decides, you know what, I've got to murder Banquo, and his son Fleance, just to make sure that the prophecy doesn't come true. So he hires these cutthroats to kill Banquo while he's out in the country with his son. They manage to do in Banquo, but of course Fleance escapes. This doesn't bring Macbeth the peace of mind that he thinks it will, though. Shortly afterwards, he almost lets the cat out of the bag at a dinner he is hosting for the other Thanes, when he hallucinates and sees the ghost of Banquo sitting in the spot that was reserved for him. He starts going ballistic, and the Thanes are wondering what's going on, while Lady Macbeth is trying to calm him down and explain to the Thanes that he always has these sorts of fits, like it's no big deal. And Macbeth says this: Murders have been performed too terrible for the ear. The time has been that when the brains wore out, the man would die, and there an end. But now they rise again, with 20 mortal murders on their crowns, and push us from our stools. This is more strange than such a murder is. This is very sarcastic and very bitter. He's basically saying, there have been other murderers before me, why am I getting punished like this? His outburst doesn't exactly instill confidence in the Thanes, and from this point in the play onwards they begin to wonder how they're going to get the tyrant, as they call him, off the throne. We see Banquo's ghost one more time before the play is over. Macbeth goes back to the witches for more information, and he asks them if after all that he's done the future still stands the way they say it did. If Banquo's descendants still stand a chance of being king or not. And he sees a vision rising out of their cauldron. The first thing he sees is Banquo's ghost, and then a line of 8 kings who file past him in a procession, the last king holding a mirror in his hand so that the line is doubled upon itself, like in figure 1 up here. Listen to what Macbeth says as they file past. Thou art too like the spirit of Banquo. Down! Thy crown does sear mine eyeballs. And thy hair, thou other gold-bound brow, is like the first. A third is like the former. Filthy hags, why do you show me this? A fourth? Start, eyes. What, will the line stretch out to the crack of doom? Another yet? A seventh? I'll see no more. And yet the eighth appears, who bears a glass which shows me many more. And some I see that twofold balls and treble scepters carry. Horrible sight. Now I see 'tis true, for the blood-boltered Banquo smiles upon me, and points at them for his. What? Is this so? Notice that some of the kings in the vision are carrying more than one ball and scepter, which are the traditional effects of kings. This implies that some of these future kings will rule more than one country. This is important because in Scottish lore it was believed that King James himself was a descendant of the historical Banquo. Remember in an earlier video we talked about how Macbeth was probably staged with King James specifically in mind. And knowing that the play was actually staged in front of him, the last king with the mirror could just as easily have positioned it so that King James, who would have been sitting in the front row of course, was looking at himself. We've seen how Shakespeare is borrowed from the classical literary tradition. In this scene, he is doing something very similar to what the Roman poet Virgil did in his epic poem, the Aeneid. The Aeneid was written sometime in the 20s AD and is about the adventures of Aeneas, a man from Greek mythology who was thought to be the founder of Rome. In actuality, it was his son who established Rome, so in that respect Aeneas is a lot like Banquo. He never got to rule a kingdom, but his descendants did. And it turned out to be one of the longest lasting and most powerful kingdoms/empires that ever existed. Virgil wrote the Aeneid during the reign of Caesar Augustus, also known as Octavius, and he was on good terms with the emperor. The situation at Rome at the time actually mirrored the situation in England during Shakespeare's time. There had been decades of civil upheaval and bloodshed, the Roman Civil War and the dictatorship of Julius Caesar, followed by the whole Mark Antony and Cleopatra debacle. Read Shakespeare's play Antony and Cleopatra if you want to know more about that. So Augustus was very well liked as the emperor. He was seen as someone who could bring stability to the country. And, like Shakespeare, Virgil makes a connection between his current ruler and patron with a famous figure from the country's semi-historic, semi-mythological past. In Book 6 of the Aeneid, Aeneas travels to the underworld, or Hades, and meets the spirit of his deceased father. And his father shows him a vision of sorts of his future descendants. And all of these famous Roman historical figures, who would have been familiar to Virgil's audience, begin filing past Aeneas and his father. And then the train of characters arrives at the present. And we read this. Aeneas' father says, turn your 2 eyes this way and see this people, your own Romans. Here is Caesar and all the line of Julius, all who shall one day pass under the dome of the great sky. This is the man, this one, of whom so often you have heard the promise, Caesar Augustus, son of the deified, who shall bring once again an age of gold to Latium, to the land where Saturn reigned in early times. He will extend his power beyond the Garamants and Indians, over far territories north and south. of the zodiacal stars, the solar way, where Atlas, heaven-bearing, on his shoulder turns the night sphere, studded with burning stars. Caesar Augustus probably had a hard time finding fault with that particular passage. So both Virgil and Shakespeare use the fact that their stories take place in the ancient past in order to make current, real-life figures look like the fulfillment of prophecies made then. Also, without Banquo to serve as a foil, the play doesn't make Scotland seem like a very nice place. So in order to portray Macbeth as a wicked fiend, it had to be established through characters like Duncan, Malcolm, and Banquo that most of the Scottish nobility was not like this. Macbeth was a fluke, but the true Scottish kings were all noble and pure and upright.